The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical dirge above Trauma Bay 4 at Mercy General. The sound was white noise most people stopped hearing after their first week, but Danielle Ross had learned long ago that sounds like that, constant, predictable, almost living, were good indicators that nothing had changed. Nothing ever changed at Mercy General. That was the safety of it. That was also the prison of it. She moved through morning rounds with the kind of quiet efficiency that came from 15 years of the same hallways, the same protocols, the same institutional rhythms. Her hands moved across the vital sign monitor with practiced precision, checking numbers that told stories only she seemed to read with any depth. Heart rate. Blood pressure. Oxygen saturation. Respiratory rate. These were the four gospels of patient survival, and she'd memorized their dialect so thoroughly that she could predict deterioration in a patient's condition before the machines even registered the decline. Her colleagues called it intuition. It wasn't. Intuition was a luxury for people with normal histories. Danielle called it pattern recognition, the same skill that had kept her alive when the world was burning down in places that didn't officially exist. The slight limp in her left leg was barely noticeable if you weren't paying attention. Car accident, she'd told the higher team at Mercy General 15 years ago. Bad accident. Healed well, mostly. The scar tissue ached when the barometric pressure dropped, but physical pain was just information. Pain was data. She'd learned that when she was someone else, in a time when her name appeared in no public records, when her service record was classified so thoroughly that even the Pentagon had officially listed her as deceased during a training exercise. Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross had been erased with bureaucratic precision. What rose from that erasure was just a nurse. A competent nurse. A quiet nurse. A nurse with no edges sharp enough to draw attention. The hospital around her moved in its own rhythm, the squeak of the stretcher wheels, the snap of latex gloves being pulled from the box with a sound like small gunshots, the persistent beeping of monitors tracking the precarious mathematics of human survival. Norfolk General's trauma unit was a cathedral built to human fragility, all stainless steel and antiseptic smell so thick you could taste the chemical burn of it on your tongue. The ventilators wheezed their mechanical breath in synchronized rhythm, a chorus of machines keeping people alive by volume alone, pure force substituting for the body's worn-out biological engines. She'd seen rooms like this before, concrete bunkers with better lighting, operating theaters where decisions meant the difference between extraction and burial. This was just cleaner. Just more legal. Danielle checked the 4 line on her current patient, Mr. Chen, 73, post-op day 2, recovering well from an elective gallbladder removal. His color was good. His oxygen saturation held steady at 96%. His daughter sat in the corner chair, pretending to read a magazine while actually watching her father breathe. That was love, Danielle understood. That was someone sitting vigil in a waiting room, terrified that the moment they stopped paying attention would be the moment the machine stopped working. She'd held that vigil once for someone who mattered. That was a different life. That was a different Danielle entirely. Good morning, Mr. Chen. Has your pain? Her voice was warm. Professional. Practiced. The voice of someone who had nothing to hide and nothing worth remembering. 3 out of 10, he said. Better than yesterday. Good. That's the trajectory we want. She made a note in his chart, her handwriting precise and clear, no abbreviations, no shortcuts, nothing that could be twisted later into evidence of negligence. 15 years of hospital work had taught her to document her life like she was preparing for a court-martial. Which, in a different time, in a different capacity, she'd actually done. 3 times. She'd won 2 of them. The shadow box at home sat on a shelf in her bedroom, behind the door where guests wouldn't see it. Inside was a faded unit patch from the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Dark Horse Company, sewn with meticulous care into the lining of her late husband's jacket. The jacket itself hung in a closet she rarely opened. He died 5 years ago from a heart attack that took him in his sleep, and she'd never told him what she was, what she'd been, what she'd spent 2 decades pretending never happened. He'd known something was wrong. He'd been military too, had served alongside the very unit that had extracted her from Baghdad 20 years prior, the same unit that had managed to pull her from a burning city and hand her a new name. But he'd never pressed. That was the covenant between soldiers who love each other: you don't ask what you don't need to know. The elevator doors opened at the end of the hallway. Danielle didn't look up from the chart. She didn't need to. Her peripheral vision had always been exceptional, another skill that came from a time when threat assessment meant the difference between breathing and not breathing. She continued noting Mr. Chen's vitals, her hand steady, her movements economical. Nothing wasted. Nothing that drew observation. Dr. James Hargrove stepped into Trauma Bay 4 with the kind of entrance that announced itself. He was new, 3 months into the position of chief of surgery, and he wore his authority like it was a tailored suit that cost more than Danielle's monthly rent. He was 56, maybe 57, with silver threading through his dark hair in a way that probably made him look distinguished at board dinners. His watch was expensive. His shoes were Italian. His presence moved through the room like pressure change before a storm, the kind of invisible shift that made everyone's shoulders tense before they consciously registered why. Hargrove arrived on Mercy General's executive fast track, the kind of hire that came with board connections and guarantees. He'd left a private practice in Charleston where, according to the hospital newsletter that no one read but everyone somehow knew about, he'd been instrumental in building relationships with the wealthiest donors in 3 counties. That was the skill they were paying for. Not surgical excellence, though his record was solid, technically competent. What they were paying for was his ability to cultivate relationships, to understand institutional politics the way other people understood oxygen exchange. Hargrove knew how to build hierarchies. He knew how to secure his position within them. He knew, instinctively, who was a threat to the careful ecosystem he was constructing. He stopped at the nurse's station, ostensibly reviewing charts, but actually watching. Danielle noticed this immediately. She'd spent her entire military career learning how to read intention in a glance, how to understand threat assessment from the angle of someone's shoulders. Hargrove was sizing up his domain. Taking inventory. Planning. The morning rounds continued. 2 more patients, both stable. A consult for post-op pain management on a surgery from the day before. Standard institutional choreography. But Hargrove's attention kept circling back to her, the way a shark moves in a circle before the approach. She could feel his eyes tracking her decisions, noting how the other nurses, there were 4 of them on the morning shift, unconsciously deferred to her judgment when Danielle pointed out potential complications or suggested medication adjustments. They'd been doing it for 15 years. It was muscle memory. She was the oldest, the most experienced, the one who'd been through enough cycles of institutional change to understand what mattered and what didn't. That authority had never been formalized. It had simply accumulated, like sediment, until she was carrying weight she'd never asked for. At 11:47, a trauma alert came through. The overhead intercom crackled, "Trauma alert." ETA for minutes. Multiple lacerations with penetrating shrapnel wounds, Iraqi national, transferred from military medical facility. Combat-related injury, ongoing stabilization. Prepare Trauma Bay 1 for emergency intake. Danielle's hand stopped moving. Her breath, which had been normal and mechanical and utterly unremarkable, became something she had to manage manually. Combat-related. Iraqi. Multiple shrapnel wounds. That combination of words opened a door in her chest that she'd nailed shut 20 years ago when they handed her new papers and a new name and told her that Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross had died in an operational mishap that would never be explained to anyone, not even her family. She made a note on the current chart. Her handwriting didn't waver. Her voice, when she spoke to Mr. Chen's daughter, was the same calm professional tone it had always been. "Your father's doing well. I'll check on him in about 20 minutes. The pain medication should be working by then." The words came automatically. Muscle memory in a different form. But her eyes were already moving toward Trauma Bay 1, already running through the mental checklist of what would be needed for a patient with multiple shrapnel lacerations. Airway management. For access. Blood type crossmatch. surgical team notification, tetanus prophylaxis, fluid resuscitation protocol. These were professional concerns. These were what any experienced trauma nurse would think about in the 90 seconds before a patient arrived. What they weren't was what Danielle was actually thinking about. What she was actually thinking about was Baghdad. What she was actually thinking about was the burning Humvee, the smell of diesel and blood mixing with the copper taste of fear, the small terrified voice of a child who didn't understand why the world was catching fire around him. What she was actually thinking about was carrying that child through 3 miles of hostile territory, her rifle slung across her back, her left leg bleeding from a wound that she wouldn't let herself acknowledge because acknowledging it meant stopping, and stopping meant death. What she was thinking about was handing that child, this small, traumatized, 7-year-old boy, to a Red Crescent nurse who didn't ask questions and disappeared into a crowd the way everyone in that city disappeared, becoming ghost among ghosts. Danielle moved toward Trauma Bay 1, her legs steady, her breathing controlled. The limp was barely noticeable. Just an old injury. Just an accident from a long time ago. The doors to the ER opened and the patient came through on a stretcher, his medical record already transferring from the military facility via encrypted digital line. His name was Marcus Webb. He was 27 years old. And when Danielle looked down at the chart, at the date of birth listed there, she understood that the boy she'd pulled from a burning Humvee in 2004 had just been delivered to her unit, broken and bleeding, calling out in a language she understood perfectly well but had spent the last 2 decades pretending she didn't. Hargrove was already there, already taking command of the bay, already positioning himself as the center of gravity around which everything else would orbit. He hadn't noticed her reaction. Most people wouldn't. But he had noticed how her hands moved with the other nurses, how her voice, when she gave instructions, made people listen. He'd noticed that someone with no formal authority was, nonetheless, the person everyone turned toward when things got urgent. That was a problem. That was threat assessment in real time. The oxygen saturation monitor showed 78%. The full line was already running normal saline at wide open, the fluid pushing into Marcus Webb's circulation in a desperate attempt to maintain blood pressure. His eyes were open. She could see them tracking movement, which meant consciousness, which meant she could see the moment he looked up at her. The moment his eyes met hers. The moment something shifted between recognition and survival, between the past and the present, between the ghosts that people carried and the flesh and blood complications of actually having to live with them. His lips moved. No sound. Just the shape of words. But she read lips the way she read everything else, with the precision of someone whose life had depended on never missing the small details. He was saying her name. Not the name on her badge. Not the name that had appeared on a hire form 15 years ago. The rank and designation that had been erased, redacted, classified into non-existence. The name that officially no longer applied to anyone, because that person was dead, had always been dead, was supposed to stay dead. The break room smelled like burnt coffee and fluorescent hum. Danielle pushed through the double doors on her lunch break, her badge catching the overhead light as it swung against her chest. 4 nurses sat clustered around the corner table, Sarah from nights, Michelle from pediatrics, and 2 others she'd worked with for nearly a decade. They were laughing about something. A real laugh, the kind that filled the space before she arrived. Danielle unwrapped her sandwich. Turkey and mustard on wheat. The same thing she'd eaten for 15 years. She chose the empty chair at their table, not because she expected welcome anymore, but because there were no other seats in the room. "Oh," Sarah said, her voice changing temperature. "I just remembered I have to." The 4 of them stood simultaneously. Not rushed. Not obvious. Just a coordinated departure, the kind that looked natural if you didn't know what you were watching. They took their plates to the sink. They left their conversation behind. The door swung shut with a pneumatic hiss. Danielle sat alone in a room designed for 8 people. She chewed. She swallowed. She didn't flinch. This happened again the next day. And the next. By Friday, the pattern was clockwork. The moment her body occupied a chair, the room emptied itself. She'd become the reason to leave. The signal to find somewhere else to be. The nurses didn't make eye contact in the hallway anymore either. They'd nod at other staff. They'd stop talking mid-sentence when she approached the med cart. At one point, Michelle literally turned and walked in the opposite direction when she saw Danielle coming down the corridor toward the supply room. The pain was information. That's what they taught you in selection. Physical pain, emotional pain, it was all data. You collected it. You catalogued it. You never let it change your hands. Her hand stayed steady. She charted correctly. She managed force with precision. She was the safest nurse on the trauma unit by every measurable metric. None of that mattered in the break room, where her presence had become a kind of curse. On the following Monday, Danielle arrived for her shift and found a printed notice posted on the unit board. Standard hospital memo paper. Dr. Hargrove's signature at the bottom in blue ink. Written warning, Nurse Danielle Ross. The words were clinical. Efficient. Devastating in their formality. Failure to follow chain of command. Questioning physician orders. Unauthorized patient advocacy. The accusations were vague enough to sound serious and specific enough to stick to her record like a barb. Everyone on the unit would read this. Families would see it. Medical students doing rotations would see it. The evidence of her incompetence was now official. Documented. Real. But that wasn't the worst part. Hargrove had started calling her our little rebel in staff meetings. The nickname caught fire the way certain things do in hospital culture, rapidly, organically, with a kind of infectious mockery that made her sound dangerous rather than dedicated. She overheard it in the hallway. She saw it in the glances exchanged between residents. By midweek, it had become the default way people referred to her when she wasn't in the room. Our little rebel. The phrase was a tiny knife, and it was being used by everyone. In the medication room, preparing post-op meds for Marcus Webb's evening pain management, Danielle pulled his file again. The chart had become a kind of prayer she couldn't stop saying. Born in Baghdad. Evacuated during Operation Iraqi Freedom. Red Crescent papers with a childhood medical profile. Height, 3 feet 4 inches. Weight, 52 pounds. Age at evacuation, 7 years old. She'd carried a 7-year-old through miles of hostile territory. She'd felt his weight against her chest, his fingers gripping the collar of her uniform, his breathing shallow with terror. She'd handed him to a Red Crescent medic and said, "Get him to safety," and then turned back into the firefight because that was the mission. 20 years. The boy would be 27 now. Exactly the age of the trauma patient in bed 4. The medication bottle shook in her fingers. She set it down. She breathed. Once. Twice. The tremor wasn't fear. It was restraint. The clenching of every muscle that wanted to move, to act, to explain something to Dr. Hargrove that would end his career in approximately 90 seconds. But she couldn't. The orders from 2 decades ago were absolute. After the operation was classified, buried, redacted into non-existence, she was to disappear. Never surface. Never claim service. Never acknowledge the woman she'd been because that woman officially didn't exist. Treason charges had teeth. They could prosecute her for disclosing information she'd been ordered to forget. So instead, she loaded the 4 pump with fentanyl, checking the dose twice. 25 micrograms per hour. Pain management without commentary. She made the rounds without speaking more than necessary. The next morning, during official rounds, Hargrove came into Marcus Webb's room with 3 medical students trailing behind him like remora fish. Danielle was adjusting Webb's post-op for medications, standard protocols, textbook dosing, nothing that warranted scrutiny. But Hargrove's eyes found her the way they always did these days. Looking for weakness. Looking for opportunity. Webb's parents sat in the corner chairs, his mother's hand wrapped around his father's arm. "Nurse Ross," Hargrove said, his voice carrying that particular edge of authority. Explain to the Webbs why their son's post-op pain management is still on the schedule I prescribed when his drainage output is clearly elevated. Danielle didn't flinch. The protocol accounts for post-surgical inflammation. His output is within normal parameters for. I didn't ask for parameters, Hargrove interrupted. I asked why you questioned a physician's orders at shift change yesterday. The room went very still. Webb's mother's grip tightened on her husband's arm. The medical student suddenly became fascinated with their shoes. Danielle kept her hand steady on the 4 pump. She was aware of her breathing. Aware of the fluorescent light buzzing overhead like an angry insect. Aware of the wall clock ticking seconds into the silence. My job is to advocate for the patient's safety, she said quietly. Your job is to follow the physician's orders, Hargrove corrected, his voice pleasant now, which somehow made it worse. Not to substitute your judgment for mine. Your assessment of safety is exactly what got that charting incident noted on your file. Rest assured, Mr. and Mrs. Webb, we're monitoring this nurse's performance very closely. He said it like she was a liability. Like her concern for their son's welfare was a problem to be managed. Like she was the obstacle between them and competent care. One measured breath. Danielle removed her hands from the 4 pump. She turned to face Dr. Hargrove directly. The moment stretched. She could feel the weight of every eye in the room. She let the moment breathe, the way a sniper lets the air settle before the shot. A single tear slid down her cheek. She didn't break eye contact. She didn't apologize for it. She wiped it away with the back of her hand and spoke to Hargrove with the kind of calm that came from having survived worse than this. Some of us measure success by who survives, she said, not who submits. The words landed like a court-martial. Webb's father sat up straighter. The medical students actually looked at her. Even Hargrove seemed to stall for a moment, his rhythm disrupted by the sheer weight of what she'd said. It wasn't a defense. It wasn't an excuse. It was a statement of purpose delivered by someone who'd already made their choice about what mattered. Danielle returned to the medication cart. She finished her rounds. She didn't apologize. She didn't explain. She didn't cry, not there, not where Hargrove could watch her break. What happened next, nobody understood yet. The phone call that would change everything was already being placed. The helicopter that would circle this hospital in exactly 4 days was already being prepped for departure. The decorations that should have been worn 20 years ago were being unsealed in the Pentagon's classified archive, waiting for a name that officially didn't exist to be restored. But in that moment, on that morning in Marcus Webb's room, the only thing anyone could see was a nurse who wouldn't break, no matter how hard they pushed. The monitor's alarm was a scream. 2 days after Marcus Webb's admission, at 2:02 a.m. on a Tuesday, his oxygen saturation crashed from 94% to 71% in the span of 40 seconds. Danielle was at the nursing station reviewing discharge paperwork when the high-pitched wail cut through the quiet hallway like a blade. She moved before thinking. Training doesn't ask permission. The ventilator hissed its mechanical rhythm as she entered Webb's room. His chest wasn't rising evenly. The right side lay flat, collapsed like a deflated tire. His lips had begun to turn the color of wet concrete. Tension pneumothorax. Air trapped in the pleural space, crushing his lung, collapsing his trachea. He had maybe 3 minutes before his heart rate spiked beyond recovery, maybe 2 before his blood pressure bottomed out. The on-call resident, Dr. Chen, stood frozen at the bedside, eyes locked on the monitor as if staring harder might change the numbers. His hands hung at his sides like useless tools. Danielle's voice was steady as surgical steel. I need a 14-gauge angiocath needle. Now. We should wait for the attending, Chen stammered. Protocol requires. Webb's oxygen sat at 58%. The monitor's rhythm was accelerating toward tachycardia that wouldn't come back. The attending is 15 minutes out. Webb is 30 seconds from cardiac arrest. Move. She didn't wait for agreement. The muscle memory took over, the same muscle memory that had kept 17 Marines alive in Fallujah during a field hospital set up with nothing but a Gerber multitool and inventory from a knocked-over supply tent. Her hands moved to Webb's chest, fingers finding the landmarks that 2 decades of medical training had burned into her nervous system. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. Right side where the air pocket pressed like a balloon about to burst. Chen finally found the needle in the crash cart and thrust it toward her. Danielle didn't take it from his hand. She reached past him, grabbed it herself, and in one motion, smooth, practiced, merciless, drove the needle through skin and muscle and the visceral membrane separating air from life. The hiss came. Air escaping under pressure. The sound of pressure equalizing. The sound of breathing room returning. Webb's oxygen began climbing immediately. 68%. 74%. 81%. The monitor's alarm softened from a wail to a warning to, finally, silence. His lips lost the concrete color. His chest began rising and falling with the ventilator's rhythm instead of fighting it. Sinus rhythm held steady on the screen above him. Normal. Alive. Not dead. Chen's hands were shaking. That was, you shouldn't have. Yes, I should have. Danielle's voice had returned to its neutral register, the voice of a nurse explaining a medication change. He was 60 seconds from arrest. We just saved him. Documentation goes in the chart under emergency response. Mark it as physician directed if it makes you comfortable. But it wasn't the truth, and Chen knew it. Danielle had made a decision that belonged to someone with more letters after their name. She'd made a choice that violated the chain of command that Dr. Hargrove had spent 3 days publicly weaponizing against her. She'd chosen Webb's life over protocol. She'd chosen wrong, if wrong meant keeping her license. The phone call came at 3:14 a.m. Danielle was back at the nursing station when she heard Dr. Hargrove's voice on the other end of the line that Chen had answered. Not a question. Not an inquiry. A voice like ice forming on still water. I'm coming in. Don't let her near that patient again. Hargrove arrived at Mercy General at 4:33 a.m. Not in scrubs. In a charcoal suit that cost more than Danielle's monthly rent, carrying a leather briefcase and rage-worn like cologne. He moved through the corridors with the precision of someone who'd already mapped every institutional lever he was about to pull. First, he stood over Webb's chart in the medication room, his phone already pressed against his ear. I need legal on this line now. We have a critical incident report. Unauthorized invasive procedure. No physician oversight. Massive liability exposure. His free hand was already pulling up the hospital's incident template on the computer. Typing. Precise. Clinical. Damning. Senior nurse performed emergency needle decompression in violation of protocol without waiting for physician authorization. I'm documenting this as a clear breach of chain of command and hospital policy for point 7.3. 20 minutes later, he stood in the administrator's office with the board chair on speakerphone. The state medical board investigator needs to be here first thing in the morning. We cannot have this buried. This nurse is a liability. She needs to be suspended immediately pending investigation, and we need legal to contact malpractice insurance right now. I'm also personally reaching out to her nursing school references to establish a pattern of judgment lapses. I want this airtight. The speakerphone crackled. You're certain about this escalation, Dr. Hargrove? Absolutely certain. She made a unilateral medical decision that circumvented physician authority. That's the kind of action that costs hospitals millions. I'm protecting us. The words landed. Hargrove had just weaponized his own competence, not screaming, not blustering, but building a case with the precision of someone who understood exactly how institutions destroyed people who didn't fit their hierarchy. He'd made calls to the state board. He'd contacted her nursing school. He'd framed her life-saving decision as insubordination. Security found her at 5:27 a.m. Danielle was finishing her shift notes when the guard, the same one who'd watched her arrive every morning for 3 years without comment, appeared with a cardboard box. His face carried the particular exhaustion of someone forced to carry out orders he didn't enjoy. "You're being suspended pending investigation," he said quietly. "Your credentials are flagged in the state system. I'm escorting you out." She didn't argue. Couldn't argue. Any explanation would require her to admit where she'd learned needle decompression technique. Any defense of her actions would require context that was classified, buried, officially non-existent. The Pentagon's rules were explicit: disappear. Never surface. Never claim the service. Prosecution for treason if classified details emerged. 20 years of silence. 20 years of following orders. She cleared her locker in 3 minutes. Badge. Stethoscope. A half-empty bottle of ibuprofen. The faded photograph of her late husband in his SEAL Team 3 dress uniform. She placed each item in the cardboard box, and when the box was full, she carried it like a coffin toward the ER exit. The rain had started sometime between Webb's emergency and now. Not a gentle rain. Norfolk rain in October, rain that came sideways, rain that felt like punishment, rain that hammered the parking lot like applause at a funeral. Danielle stood at the edge of Mercy General's portico, the cardboard box growing damp in her hands, and watched the rain obliterate the parking lot. Her credentials. Her job. Her carefully constructed identity as someone unremarkable. All of it dissolving like soluble medication in water. She didn't cry. The trembling that moved through her wasn't weakness. It was the sound of restraint finally reaching its breaking point. But that wasn't the worst part. Somewhere in the hospital, Webb was beginning to wake. The tension pneumothorax was resolved. His oxygen saturation had stabilized to 96%. The procedure that should have killed her career had actually saved his life. And in exactly 12 hours, when visiting hours opened, when the people Webb knew began to arrive, when the ones he'd served with began to show up, everything that Danielle had buried was about to surface whether she was ready or not. The rain fell harder. She stood there in it, cardboard box against her chest, and waited for the phone call that would change everything. The rain fell harder. She stood there in it, cardboard box against her chest, and waited for the phone call that would change everything. But the phone never rang. Instead, silence came, the kind of silence that follows a final door closing, the kind that tells you there's no going back. Danielle Ross had been escorted from Mercy General at 4:41 p.m. on a Tuesday, the same way felons leave courthouses. Security guard named Morrison, the one who'd always smiled at her in the break room, wouldn't meet her eyes as he handed her the box. 17 years of trauma response, 3 commendations from the state nursing board, a reputation built on hands that had held people together when their bodies were coming apart, all of it fit inside a cardboard container the size of a showbox. Her scrubs. Her laminated ID badge. A coffee mug someone had given her 5 years ago that said "Keep Calm" and code blue. The clinical cruelty of it almost made her laugh. But Danielle didn't laugh. She'd learned a long time ago that emotions were luxuries that soldiers couldn't afford. She'd learned it in a desert where 14 minutes meant the difference between rescue and recovery operations. She'd learned it watching a 7-year-old boy choke on his own blood while she ran through enemy fire, her hands the only thing standing between him and a grave. That was 20 years ago. This was now. And now, her credentials were suspended, her name was being dragged through a state medical board investigation, and Dr. Hargrove had already begun making calls to every major hospital in Virginia, Norfolk to Richmond, poisoning her name before she could even interview. The rain hammered the parking lot like applause for a show nobody wanted to see. She sat in her car for 20 minutes, the cardboard box on the passenger seat, and watched the lights of the hospital glow against the dark sky. Mercy General. The name felt like a lie now. There was no mercy in this. There was only the machinery of institutional power grinding forward, Dr. Hargrove's network expanding like a cancer, 3 board members, 2 lawyers, a state investigator, and somewhere in that constellation of calls and emails, her entire career being reduced to a single phrase, an authorized procedure, protocol violation, danger to patients. What they didn't understand was that the procedure had saved Marcus Webb's life. When the on-call resident froze, when the ventilator started sounding wrong, when Danielle recognized the signs of air collapsing his lung faster than his heart could compensate, her hands had moved without waiting for permission. 14-gauge angiocath needle. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. The hiss of air escaping. His oxygen saturation climbing from 68 to 84 in 30 seconds. That was medicine. That was saving a life. And that was why they were destroying her. The hospital was gone now in her rearview mirror. Just taillights and rain and the sound of wipers squeaking against glass. That night, Danielle drove to Riverside Cemetery in the northeast corner of Norfolk, the one with the old oak trees and the section reserved for military families. The rain hadn't stopped. If anything, it had intensified, coming down in sheets that made the world look like it was drowning. She parked on the narrow drive and walked, her jacket soaked through within seconds, until she found the grave marker she'd been visiting every Saturday for 3 years. The headstone was granite, simple, with a Navy SEAL trident carved at the top. Michael James Ross. 1977 to 2021, beloved husband. Father. Warrior. She'd never told him. That was the thing that would haunt her forever. She'd married him knowing he was SEAL Team 3, knowing he'd seen things that left marks no surgeon could see, knowing that his nightmares sometimes woke them both at 3 in the morning. But she'd never told him about Baghdad. She'd never told him about the boy, about the operation, about the fact that her official military record was a classified tomb and she was supposed to be dead for all legal purposes. The Pentagon's rules had been absolute: disappear, never surface, never claim service. If classified details emerged, if her existence became known, she'd be prosecuted for treason. So she'd married him in silence and carried the weight of an entire life in the space between her ribs. Michael had been killed 3 years ago in a training accident that the Navy had never fully explained. Fast rope malfunction. That's all they'd said. She'd held the flag at his funeral and watched 3 SEALs play taps while the rain fell, and nobody mentioned what he'd done, where he'd been, or what he'd given. Just like she'd never be able to mention what she'd done. Both of them ghosts in their own lives. Danielle sank to her knees in front of the headstone, rain streaming down her face, mixing with tears she couldn't control. The cardboard box sat on the wet grass beside her. I kept my head down like they ordered, she whispered. I followed every rule. I didn't surface. I didn't claim anything. I saved lives and stayed invisible. Her voice cracked. I saved that boy twice, Michael. Twice. And I can't even tell anyone. And it still wasn't enough. They are still destroying me. The rain was washing her words away as fast as she spoke them. The cemetery was empty. The trees dripped like dying for stands. She was alone in this grave-filled place, kneeling in mud, holding a cardboard box that contained the last 18 years of her life. But somewhere in Mercy General, 37 floors below and 4 miles away, Marcus Webb was still alive because of her. That had to mean something. It had to. The next evening, the chaos announced itself like a siren nobody had expected. Khalid Nazari, the cardiac patient admitted to the 4th floor ER at 6:32 p.m., was experiencing a second cardiac event. His alarm was screaming so loud they could hear it 2 units over, a sound like a machine begging for help it couldn't provide. But Danielle wasn't there to hear it. She was at home, sitting in her kitchen, watching her security clearance get revoked on a computer screen, when the hospital security guard named Morrison knocked on her door with news that would remake her entire world. He didn't speak when she opened the door. He just handed her a phone and walked backward into the rain. The voice on the line belonged to a woman named Lieutenant Commander Patricia Chen from the Navy Judge Advocate General's office. What she said took 43 seconds to deliver and would take the rest of Danielle's life to comprehend. Senior Chief, your mission from Baghdad has been declassified as of 0800 this morning. It's being referenced in ongoing war crimes proceedings. The Pentagon needs your testimony. You're being restored to active status, effective immediately. Return to Mercy General. They've been notified. Someone will meet you there. Danielle stood in her doorway, rain soaking her clothes, and couldn't find words. Declassified. After 20 years, the operation that had supposedly never happened had been declassified. The boy she'd carried through enemy fire, that moment was no longer classified. Her service record, erased for 2 decades, was being restored. She was allowed to exist again. She didn't hesitate. She was in her car 12 minutes later, driving toward Mercy General like someone pulled by gravity they couldn't resist. The hallway outside the trauma unit on the 4th floor at 7:19 p.m. was a collision of sounds and chaos. Khalid Nazari's bed was being rushed past the nursing station, and the cardiac alarm was screaming, and at least 30 people were moving in different directions. But Danielle heard something else beneath it all. She heard her call sign. Her rank. Her name. In Arabic. Senior Chief. Senior Chief Ross. Call sign Reaper. Baghdad operation. The voice belonged to the man in the bed, Khalid Nazari, a translated name, a reformed identity, a person who was supposed to be transformed by 15 years of UN work and therapy and the long process of becoming someone new. But the moment he saw her face, his own transformation reversed. His eyes went wide. He yanked at his full line with the desperation of someone who needed to reach toward salvation. Reaper. Reaper. It's me. Khalid. You remember. The boy. The extraction. He was pulling at his personal effects, his hands trembling with cardiac stress and something else, recognition, gratitude, a 15-year-old debt finally being called due. His fingers closed around a faded photograph, creased and yellowed from an asylum file that had documented his entire journey toward this moment. Staff tried to quiet him, tried to keep him still, but Khalid wasn't interested in rest. He was pulling the photograph free, his voice getting louder, more urgent, each word in Arabic echoing down the hallway like someone calling across impossible distance. The crowd grew around them. Nurses stopped mid-stride. A doctor dropped a clipboard. The sound of it hitting tile was like a gunshot in the chaos. And then Dr. Hargrove appeared, termination paperwork in his hands, his face already forming the words that would finish the job, would silence this man and erase this claim and restore the fiction that Danielle Ross was nobody important. But at that precise moment, Marcus Webb heard his voice. Webb, still intubated, still conscious, still tethered to machines that were keeping him alive because of a woman they'd all been taught to dismiss. His trembling hand reached for the tablet a nurse had left at his bedside. His fingers, weak and shaking, found the keys. His jaw moved around the tube in his throat. He pressed send. The message appeared on the trauma unit screen, Senior Chief Petty Officer. 3 words. The digital equivalent of a door opening in a wall nobody had realized was there. And in the hallway, frozen mid-stride, Danielle felt something shift. The boy from Baghdad was still shouting. The photograph was visible now, unmistakable, a woman in full combat gear, eyes hard as flint, standing over an extraction zone. And Marcus Webb was declaring her rank for everyone who could hear. The SEAL team leader who'd been waiting in the family room for Webb's status update walked out into the hallway. He was 6'2", with the kind of presence that made the air pressure change, like the world was rearranging itself around his arrival. His eyes moved from Khalid's face to the photograph on the floor to the 3 words still glowing on Webb's screen. Something clicked into place behind his eyes. Recognition. Understanding. Confirmation of something he'd suspected the moment Webb had asked about his nurse. Hargrove tried to assert control, tried to reclaim the narrative. Everyone stepped back. This woman is no longer employed? But the SEAL team leader stepped forward, and his voice, quiet, steady, carrying the weight of 20 years of operations and classified moments and truths that had been buried deeper than graves, cut through everything. Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross. The hallway went silent. Not the silence of confusion. The silence of transformation. The moment when the world stops and recognizes that everything it thought it knew was built on lies. United States Navy Special Warfare Group, the seal continued. Each word was deliberate, weighted, forming an architecture of truth that couldn't be denied. Baghdad Operation, Call Sign Reaper. Classified Extraction, 2004. Behind him, a second seal emerged from the waiting room. Then a third. Then a fourth. They moved like a unit, even standing still, their presence announcing itself without sound. Khalid was weeping openly now, holding the photograph against his chest like a religious icon. 2 silver stars, the second seal said, his voice echoing down the hallway. Someone in the crowd whispered, "Oh my God." For bronze stars with valor, the third seal announced. Danielle stood perfectly still. One tear slid down her cheek, but she didn't break. Her composure held like a dam holding back a storm that had been building for 20 years. Purple Heart with 3 clusters, the fourth seal continued. A nurse gasped. A patient in a nearby room sat up, eyes wide. The photograph, still visible on the floor, was drawing stares from every direction, that image of a woman in combat gear, young, fierce, the kind of warrior you didn't expect to find pushing medication carts and running code blues. Navy Cross for actions in Baghdad, classified operation, the first seal finished. And that's when the FBI liaison arrived. The badge came out first, bright and official and carrying the weight of federal authority. Behind him, 2 military police officers in dress uniform moved through the crowd like they'd been waiting for this moment their entire careers. The liaison's eyes found Hargrove, locked on him with the precision of a targeting system. "I need to speak with hospital administration immediately regarding a federal witness," the liaison said. He turned to Danielle. "Your mission has been declassified as of 0800 this morning as part of ongoing war crimes tribunal proceedings. Your testimony is required. Your service record is being restored." The hallway erupted. Phones started ringing. Someone was calling administration. Someone else was pulling security footage. The machinery that had been working to destroy Danielle reversed direction with such violence that it created its own chaos. The SEAL team leader moved through the crowd toward her, but Khalid reached out first, his hand trembling, tears streaming down his face, the photograph still clutched against his chest. "You saved my life," he whispered in English this time, his voice broken. "When I was enemy, you showed mercy." Danielle met his eyes. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The moment held everything that words could never contain. Marcus Webb's eyes locked onto hers across the morphine-heavy distance of his hospital bed, and his right hand moved with the desperate precision of a man who'd spent 20 years waiting for this moment. He couldn't speak, the endotracheal tube still secured his airway, still pumping oxygen into lungs that had nearly given up, but his fingers found the nurse's tablet on the bedside tray. 3 words appeared on the screen, each letter deliberate, each keystroke a hammer strike of recognition, Senior Chief Petty Officer. The room shifted. Not visibly. Not in any way that registered on the monitors or the charts. But the air pressure changed, the way it changes before a storm breaks, and every person standing within sight of that tablet felt it. Behind them, near the doorway where he'd been sitting for the past 6 hours in a waiting room that smelled of burnt coffee and desperation, a man stepped forward. He was smaller than he should have been, the UN credential around his neck suddenly looking fragile as tissue paper, the careful translator's posture he'd cultivated over 15 years of peacebuilding work falling away like a shed skin. His hand shook as he reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew something that had no business existing in a modern hospital, a photograph, its edges brittle with age, its colors faded to the sepia of archived evidence. In the photo, a woman in full combat gear, her face painted for night operations, her eyes the exact shade of stone that doesn't break. Her rank was visible on her sleeve. Her call sign was written in faded marker on her vest. The man who'd been an insurgent in Fallujah, the man Danielle had captured, interrogated, and somehow, against all protocol, had seen a path to redemption held the photograph toward the gathered crowd like a priest offering communion. "This is her," he whispered in accented English. "I knew her voice. I knew her hands. 20 years I wondered if she was real or if my mind invented her because I needed to believe something good existed in that war." His voice cracked. She was real. She was always real. At that moment, the ER doors burst open with the specific kind of authority that comes from men who've learned to move through hostile territory without asking permission. 3 of them, maybe 4, it was hard to count when they moved like that, like water finding cracks, like predators recognizing their own kind. The first one stepped directly to Marcus Webb's bedside, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 2 decades of brotherhood, Senior Chief Petty Officer Ross. "You don't know me, but you know my unit. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Charlie Platoon. Marcus here was 7 years old in Jolan District when you pulled him from a burning Humvee." He paused. The room had stopped breathing. "I'm going to tell you what the Navy's going to tell you very soon. 2 silver stars." He said it like a prayer. The words hung there, sacred. "For bronze stars with valor." Another pause, this one long enough to hear the ventilator's steady hiss. "Purple Heart with 3 clusters. 3 separate acts of violence that hadn't killed her, 3 separate reasons she should have died but didn't. And a Navy Cross." The last medal hung in the silence like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing. Danielle's hands remained perfectly steady. That was the thing people never understood about training. Composure wasn't about feeling nothing. Composure was about feeling everything and choosing not to let it move your hands. Her jaw didn't clench. Her eyes didn't water. She simply stood there in her scrubs, still the same scrubs, still with the security escort's thumbprints on her cardboard box of possession sitting in her car outside, and received the truth of herself like medicine. The SEAL team leader nodded once, the gesture carrying the weight of protocol observed and honor witnessed. "There's someone coming to see you, Im. Federal. About an hour out." He arrived in exactly 58 minutes. The FBI liaison, Special Agent Carlos Mendez, mid-50s, carrying the particular exhaustion that comes from prosecuting war crimes from 7,000 miles away, sat down in the hospital's small administrative office with Danielle, a hospital lawyer who'd suddenly remembered she existed, and the hospital's CEO, who'd been making phone calls since the photograph appeared. "Your classified mission," Mendez said, not as a question but as a statement of fact, was declassified this morning as part of the Fallujah War Crimes Tribunal. 3 senior Ba'athist commanders we've been hunting for 15 years? Your testimony puts them in that compound on the night of April 14, 2004. Your team's actions that night, the extraction, the witness preservation, the restraint you showed with the translator, that's the foundation of the entire prosecution." He leaned forward slightly. "Your service record is no longer sealed. It's active evidence. And you're a required witness in a federal case with international jurisdiction." The hospital lawyer's face went a very specific shade of white, the shade of someone who suddenly understood that the termination paperwork they'd been about to sign was federal obstruction of justice. "Your security clearance remains valid," Mendez continued. "Your credentials are restored as of this morning, 0600 hours. And Dr. Hargrove's investigation into your conduct. It's now material to understanding whether he was conducting legitimate performance review or whether he was engaged in targeted harassment of a federal witness." The words landed like depth charges in still water. The hospital board meeting convened within the hour. Danielle didn't attend, she didn't need to. The FBI liaison explained the federal case to the assembled administrators with the precision of a man who'd spent 2 decades making certain people understood what they'd done. The state medical board investigator who'd driven to Norfolk at Hargrove's request excused himself halfway through, citing a clerical misunderstanding that required his immediate attention in Raleigh. The board members who'd taken Hargrove's calls during their morning coffee, who'd nodded along as he explained why the hospital had a competency problem with its trauma nursing staff, began studiously examining their notepads. One of them, a woman named Patricia Chen who'd been cultivated by Hargrove for 3 years, mentored through committee work, praised in public forums, spoke with the particular coldness that comes from betrayal. "Dr. Hargrove, can you explain why you failed to conduct a basic background investigation before pursuing disciplinary action against a decorated service member?" Hargrove opened his mouth. Closed it. The room held the quality of a courtroom after the verdict's been read. Another board member, older, with the bearing of someone who'd served himself, a Navy Cross recipient. Publicly escorted from the premises by security. The hospital's legal exposure here is, I'm going to be direct, it's catastrophic. You've made us liable for damages we can't calculate. In the hallway outside, behind a closed door, Marcus Webb had been extubated 3 hours earlier. His throat was raw. His lungs still ached with the specific soreness that comes from having a plastic tube doing their work for them. But he could speak, and when his parents sat down beside his bed with the careful movements of people who'd been scared for 48 hours straight, his voice came out steady. She saved my life twice. Once when I was 7, in the burning vehicle. I didn't know her name, just her voice telling me to hold on. And once yesterday, in that hallway, when she knew exactly what was wrong before any of the doctors did. His mother's hand covered her mouth. I've spent 20 years trying to find her, Marcus said. Followed her trail through medical records, military databases, anything I could access. I knew she was a nurse. I knew she was here. He looked at his father. When I saw her face, I knew. The same eyes. The same hands. The same way she moves, like she's already solved the problem before she walks into the room. His SEAL team leader had already made the calls. Within hours, the formal commendation review was initiated. Within hours, Danielle's record wasn't just restored, it was being actively honored by the very institution that had tried to bury it. Meanwhile, in the break room where she'd eaten lunch alone while staff filed out one by one, nurses were approaching her with a particular shame of people who'd chosen social safety over moral clarity. Danielle accepted their apologies with the composure of a woman who'd long ago learned that human beings are flawed and that holding grudges was a luxury she'd never been able to afford. One measured breath between each "I'm sorry." One steady hand on each shoulder. No recriminations. Just grace, which is the most devastating thing you can offer someone who hurt you. At 6:38 p.m. on a Tuesday, the hospital CEO called Dr. Hargrove into his office and requested his immediate resignation, effective immediately, pending a formal review of his conduct and potential referral to the medical board for disciplinary action. The CEO didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The words federal witness and targeted harassment were doing sufficient work on their own. Hargrove's hands trembled as he signed the resignation letter. For the first time in their interaction, he showed the weakness Danielle had never allowed herself to show. He broke. He actually broke, right there at the mahogany desk where he'd spent 3 years cultivating his image as a reformer, a modernizer, a man of standards. The facade cracked like old paint, and what emerged underneath was just fear, the fear of a man who'd built his entire existence on institutional approval and had just discovered how quickly institutions abandon you when the wind changes. That night, as rain hammered Norfolk like applause, a security guard approached Hargrove's office. It was the same guard, the former Marine who'd handed Danielle her cardboard box of termination and shame. He carried an identical box, empty except for whatever remained of Hargrove's personal possessions. The guard, whose name was Patterson and whose father had served in the same unit that pulled Danielle from Baghdad, met Hargrove's eyes with the particular steadiness of men who know the cost of honor. "I believe you know the way out, sir," Patterson said. "Just that. Nothing more." Hargrove left through the same entrance where Danielle had left, past the same security checkpoint, into the same rain. The guard watched him go with the kind of satisfaction that comes from witnessing the small but absolute triumph of justice operating at human scale. 6 months later, Danielle stood in dress uniform, the blue still crisp from storage, the rank still foreign on her shoulders despite belonging there all along, and raised her right hand before a congressional committee investigating war crimes in Iraq. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the specific weight of someone who'd finally stopped hiding. "My unit's mission on April 14, 2004, she began, was to extract a detained individual before the interrogation could proceed beyond the point of legal admissibility. What we found was evidence. What we found was a choice." Marcus Webb sat in the gallery behind her, also in dress blues, his chest bearing the insignia of his platoon. His eyes never left her face. Her testimony lasted 40 minutes. Each word was precise, each detail corroborated by records that had been sealed and were now unsealed, by witnesses who could finally speak because the war was over and the distance was safe enough for truth. 3 senior commanders were convicted on the strength of her testimony. 3 men who'd organized the kind of violence that creates the need for nurses, the kind of violence that marks people even when it doesn't leave visible scars. When she was finished, she turned to step down from the witness chair, and the congressional chamber, jaded, political, accustomed to performance, broke into applause. Not because she was crying. Not because she was broken. But because she was whole, and she was strong, and she'd carried her truth all this distance without ever allowing it to destroy her. The applause sounded like healing. In Ohio, in a community college basement where fluorescent lights buzzed with the specific frequency of budget-constrained institutions, Dr. Hargrove demonstrated CPR compressions on a plastic torso for $9 an hour. His medical license remained under review in 3 states. His network had dissolved with the specific efficiency of people recognizing a sinking ship. The board members who'd enabled him sent their quiet resignations within weeks. The institution that had seemed permanent revealed itself to be circumstantial. But it was Danielle's final act that completed the reckoning. The hospital established a formal training program, the Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross Excellence in Combat Medicine Initiative, which brought active-duty SEAL combat medics into Norfolk every quarter to train the civilian nursing staff in emergency procedures they'd never need until they suddenly did. Marcus Webb came as a peer instructor, his expertise earned through 20 years of standing on the edge of the thing that destroys people, having learned everything from a woman who'd saved him when he was small enough to carry. That night, 6 months after the photograph, after the medals were named, after the federal case was closed, Danielle finally allowed herself to open the boxes she'd never been able to touch. Her husband's things. 3 years of his life she'd been too afraid to examine, too scared of what she might find or not find, too exhausted by the weight of her own secrets to carry his as well. Inside his dress uniform jacket, sewn into the lining with the care of someone who understood the meaning of threads and stitches and holding things together, was a unit patch. Not just any unit patch. The patch of the same 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines that pulled her from Baghdad. The same unit he'd secretly joined after they married, not because he didn't trust her, but because he wanted to understand her. Because he needed to stand where she'd stood, needed to know the brothers who'd raised her into whatever she'd become. A letter fell out, handwritten, dated for years into their marriage. To my wife, whose real name I've always known, whose service I've always honored in silence. The Pentagon can keep your files sealed. Your brothers kept you safe. But I needed to know what they knew. I needed to stand where you'd stood so I could understand the architecture of your strength. I chose to watch over you the only way I could. In the dark. In the brotherhood you couldn't claim. Your secret was safe with me. Your love was real. It was the realest thing in any of my identities. Semper Fi. Danielle actually broke, for the first time in 3 years, the first time since she'd stood at his grave and whispered her failure to a man who'd known her all along. The tears came like the release of a dam, like the acknowledgement of something so perfectly perfect that it could only exist in the privacy of grief and gratitude combined. But the next morning, she returned to Mercy General. Returned to the unit that had exiled her and then welcomed her back. Returned to Marcus Webb and a room full of young nurses and 3 active-duty combat medics who understood exactly what she was teaching them because they'd lived it. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrubs, saving lives in the dark. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel, because there are thousands more stories just like this, stories of hidden strength, stories of justice delayed but never denied, stories of people who carried more than anyone knew. Like this video, comment below, what would you have done in Danielle's position? And if you haven't already, turn on notifications so you never miss an upload.